Welcome to Bandit's Keep. I'm Daniel. This week I want to dive into mapping a little bit. I've talked about mapping before on this channel, and I was re-inspired to talk about it because in my quest to get my algorithm fixed back to D&D stuff after watching way too many episodes of Sandwiches of History, I was just watching a bunch of videos, and I came across one. I'm sorry, I cannot remember what channel it was on. It wasn't one I was subscribed to. I was just kind of watching videos, and they kind of, in a funny way, were talking about how that, Gandalf and the Frodo and those people on the Fellowship, I guess, weren't like pulling out graph paper to map Moria, right? So you shouldn't have to do that either. Well, I mean, first of all, that's a novel. This is a game. That would be my argument if I was in a debate. But, it made me think there's lots of different ways to map. And I think that my table in general, I don't just do one thing. I don't know if I try to make that clear, I think, on this channel, but let me just say it. There's no one way to do anything. And I often change things up depending on the adventure, what's happening at my table at the moment, how I feel that day, how the group feels that day. So it's good to explore different ways to see how we do different things. I wouldn't say there's anything that's better or worse about different ways, but I want to dig into a couple of different types of mapping, like how we might map or not map. And then I want to talk a little bit about a mapless dungeon, which is something that I've heard people talk about, but I think this game here, Crown and Skull, in my opinion, has one of the best versions of. This is a Runehammer game, came out, I think, this year, and it's very cool if you haven't checked it out. If you want me to talk more about Crown and Skull, let me know. I don't usually talk, I don't game reviews on this channel, but there's some really cool mechanics in here that I think makes the game worth picking up. Anyways, we're going to talk about traditional mapping, why we might map, why we don't map. We'll talk a little bit about the mapless dungeon, and let's get to it. Oh, I should also say what I'm not going to address in this video is the idea of just like putting a map down on the table, whether it be with miniatures or just on the table, about having a VTT where you can just see the map. I'm not high-tech enough to use the dynamic lighting. I think those are different types of situations, and maybe that's another video, but we're going to talk about all the rest of the mapping. The mapper as a game. Let's start with kind of classic D&D, traditional D&D, I guess they might call it, where like BX, OD&D, AD&D, I guess. And this is where it's kind of implied or assumed that the players will be mapping. That is to say, the thing that video kind of made fun of, like, oh, Samwise isn't carrying graph paper. And in this type of situation, the mapping is in and of itself a mini game. So we aren't thinking about this, and there's been lots of conversations. There was a great conversation around the podcast, I think it was around the Whispering GM podcast, really, where it was the idea of, is the map an actual artifact in the world, right? And different people's opinions on that. So go listen to Whispering GM, go some of the back episodes, you'll find it. But it's really interesting. I think that there's pros and cons to this type of play. I've done both, that is to do this way and other things, but there's definitely reasons why I did it. So let's look at that. Pros, as it would be. So the pros, in my opinion, are what I already stated, which is it's a mini game. And because of that, I think you get, and I know people imagine, and maybe people feel this way when they first start doing it, that everyone who's not mapping kind of starts looking at their phones or whatever. That's not necessarily the case, I don't think. I think people pay attention more to the actual details of the space of the room, not necessarily what's in the room, but the space of the room when you are running a campaign where the mapping is important. There is a true sense of discovery. And as somebody who's mapping it thoroughly, and I've talked before about mapping it very casually, which is what I generally do when people don't require maps and we're just kind of doing a one-shot. But if you're mapping thoroughly, there's this idea that like you can find the secret rooms by looking at your map, right? There's another game here. And I think that's really fun. Now, a con, of course, could be and will be that if you're not used to playing this way, when you first start doing it, it's going to be slow. I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it and say it's not slow. It's going to be slow. People have to get used to doing it. They have to get used to the pacing of it. The GM has to get used to describing things in a certain way, always and consistently. The players that are mapping have to pay attention to it, and they're going to ask a lot of questions. It's going to slow down the game in a sense, but again, it is the game. So is it really slowing it down? It just becomes a different aspect. The other thing, though, and this is related to that, is if you've got a game that some players get really into the immersion of it, they want to close their eyes and imagine as you're describing the different dungeon rooms they're in the dungeon. Well, for them, when you go 1 square, 2 squares, 3 squares, that might, break them out of that. So I could definitely see that as a downside. Either way, my advice for this type of thing is If you're going to run a mapper as a minigame type campaign, don't just throw it in the middle of a campaign, and don't be inconsistent. This is the kind of thing that you start at the beginning of when you're going to run something. Let's say you're going to do a mega dungeon. You say, look, maps are going to be important here. You're going to need to map. And you get people involved right away, and you kind of work through the, if you will, struggle of dealing with it. If you're coming from a very narrative table and you've never played like this before and you're trying to get people into old school games from other games or whatever, I wouldn't start this way. This might turn some people off, right? But if you have people that want the full immersion of that type of game and not necessarily just the narrative immersion, then I think the mapper as a game is a really fun way to map. Dungeon point crawl. Okay, so we've talked about point crawls before versus hex crawls, right? Versus narrative. And in the wilderness exploration, the same is true in a dungeon. You can make point crawl type maps. That is to say that you just have your little circles or squares with the description of the main rooms, and then you just kind of put connecting lines so they can curve and shift, and you can write little descriptive text if you want. But effectively, when you step into a path from one room to the other, that's where you're going. It's simpler in a lot of ways to map for the players. They just kind of draw a line. They can even write 1,000 feet or whatever, and that's it. This is actually how I normally map when there's no map required. If I am somebody playing in the game, I'm a player. The DM's describing left turn, right turn, up, and we don't turn or actually leave the hallway. I just draw a line and just put little lines if there's stuff coming off, and then when we go into a room, I just draw a square there, right? If we're not worried that much about it, again, usually a one-shot, a location that we're only going to do once, or I'm not really digging for the secret doors, this is how I map personally, and this is a good way to get people into mapping if you are trying to get your group to do it. Teach them the point crawl technique. Teach them that make a little square for the first room, write a little note next to it, draw a line where they go, make another little note. This is all you need. You don't need every twist, turn, whatever. You just need the nodes, if you will. Of course, the pros to this is you get a decent amount of the mini game of the mapper without the slowness of it, right? It should be way faster than the other one because you're not worrying about the corridors. And I found that the corridors are usually the part that's the slow part to map, right? What you lose here, the con, is you lose the ability to like screw it up too much and get lost, right? That's part of the mapper game that you win, if you will, in the other situation where you don't screw up and you actually know where you're at and you're like, oh, hold on, we're level with this other room. So if we go north here and then east, we'll connect to that room. You know, that's what you get when you map the other way. You just kind of understand the space and you go, there's got to be this here. Whereas in the point crawl one, you don't get that, right? It's much more abstracted. So you kind of lose that detail, that winning, if you will, but you also make it faster. I'm also going to say that a lot of the dungeons that I've picked up, like from other people or, that are sold or whatever you want to call it, in mostly 5-room dungeons as it would be, use this kind of a style, and it feels really linear a lot of times. That's the con. If you're going to make a dungeon like this, make sure that everything isn't just going in a straight line. Make sure there's loops and make sure that there's dead ends and make sure that there's ways to go way off track so it feels like a dungeon that they can get lost in if you want that kind of exploration feel. If you just want it to be a 5-room dungeon, maybe you don't need a map at all. The Mapless Dungeon. So I'm going to talk about this in 2 ways. First, I'm going to talk about what I just kind of said, and then I'm going to get into what Crown and Skull does, which I think is pretty brilliant. So, number 1, if you just have a, quote, 5-room dungeon, then all you really need is what those things are and your imagination if it's a one-shot, if people aren't going to come back, and if you're good at improvising. This is not an uncommon way to run an adventure. I often will run something like this. I will just bullet point out the things that are in the adventure, and as we explore, I just narrate and create as I go. But again, when it's a one-shot, when I don't have to come back to it again, when I don't have to be as precise, when they're not going to try to go back that same way, or if they do, I just have to go, okay, well, you go back through what you did, and that kind of thing. It's a little bit less perfect, but a lot simpler. So if I have some locations, let's say in my main world, that I know something's there, but I haven't really fleshed out, the way I generally flesh them out is just with bullet points. And if the party just goes there without me being ready, for lack of a better word, this is the type of narration that I do. I don't worry about the map. I know what's there. I just kind of make it up. And if it ends up being more than one session, as soon as we're done, I make sure I, jot down a map or I create the map as I'm going. as best as I can with the players there watching me. Usually then it will be a point crawl map because, again, that's simpler to do. It loses a little bit versus having like a really well-drawn map, again, that they can discover, but it still gives you a map. It still gives you an eventual location. You don't have to say, oh, you can't go there because I don't know what's there yet. Well, then why is it on the map, right? So that's how I kind of do it. But let's get into what Crown and Skull does. Now, I'm going to try to explain this in the most simple terms, and I'm not going to do too much of a giveaway here either because I think you should go get the game. It's not super expensive. Jump on Runehammer, grab it. It's really nice. You don't have to get the fancy book like I have, but you can definitely pick up the PDF just to get these rules. And effectively, this is how it works. When you're creating a dungeon, for each level or each main area of the dungeon, you create 4 locations and 4 encounters. One of those 4 locations, the number 4, will be the exit, okay? When the players enter a space, they roll 2d4. If they roll, let's say, a 1 on the locations, and the location number 1 is a goblin nest, and they roll 3 for the encounter, and the encounter is giant spiders, well, they've just crept into what is clearly the goblin barracks, but there's no goblins around. Why, though? Well, this area has been taken over by these giant spiders. There could be a combat, whatever, right? You're going to now put these 2 things together and make them work. If they roll next 4 and 2, and 4 is the exit, right? And 2 is the goblins. Now all of a sudden they've come to the tunnels that are heading down deeper in the dungeon, and there's a group of goblins returning, right? And this is basically how you do it. You kind of work your way through it. And of course you narrate in between, you go through twists and turns and tunnels. And the beauty of this is that if they roll the same thing again, you can either make the space bigger, which is kind of what is described in here quite a bit, or in my mind, I kind of think to myself, well, they enter the goblin warrens, they think they're leaving them, and they roll goblin warrens again. Well, you go down the corridors, you twist, you turn, whatever, blah, blah, and you find yourself back in the goblin warrens. You're effectively lost, right? And that's kind of what you can do. If you encounter the same thing twice and it makes sense, there can be more giant spiders, or you just don't have them be there. This is how you work your way through this dungeon. So there is prep here. It's not linear because it's being created on the fly. The players are being involved in it as you go. And of course, obviously they'd have to know that. And you got to have the players that love that kind of randomness. And there's just this kind of quirky randomness on the fly improv with prep balance that just really works. Now, again, I said each section of the dungeon. So if you have 3 or 4 sections of the dungeon, that exit goes to the beginning, whichever D4 roll you make of the next level, and so on and so on. And that's basically how you do it. So you don't have to map it. And this would be great for like Moria, right? This would be perfect in my mind for this. You don't have to map it as you go. You obviously, again, you're going to, as a GM, I would make notes, I'd blob where they went, whatever. You can just write the numbers in there, honestly. And that way you keep track of it, right? Because I think that's important. It's important to be consistent. The book gets into how you really use this much better than I'm describing it. But I think that this can really work. If you don't want to draw a map and you're like in the situation that I said before where you just have a bunch of bullet points, if I just spend a little bit longer and do this technique instead of just the bullet points, I can have a very dynamic dungeon. Anyways, I haven't actually tried this, but I've played enough dungeons and done enough different things to know that this is very cool. And in my opinion, very innovative. Maybe there's other systems that do something similar. I haven't really played them, not so much like this. And I really enjoyed the creativity of it. The whole game really is very, now I'm like pitching a game, but that's cool. I mean, again, I don't do game reviews here, but I can say grab Crown and Skull if you have a chance. It's very innovative, very cool, lots of stuff to pull from it. And this is something you could easily pull and stick in your game. So if you don't want to do the mapper game, if the point crawl feels a little bit too linear to you, if you don't necessarily want to improv everything along the way, this style of mapless dungeon could be the way to go for you. Let me know how you guys do dungeons. How do you do it? Do you just theater of mind make stuff up? Do you have elaborate maps? Do you make your players map? Do you give them a map? Maps. Tell me about them in the comments below. Check the description. I'll see if I should be able to find a link to this Crown and Skull so you guys can find it if you'd like. Also, there's a link to my Patreon down there, my Discord server. Oh, don't forget, I'm in a podcast with KR King from D&D Homebrew, Monsters and Treasure. Check that out. Link in the description. I'll talk to you soon.